On the surface, our life seemed ordinary, even peaceful, though in truth, every single day carried a weight most people couldn't imagine. Because raising a disabled child means carrying not only your own pain, but theirs as well. And I wore that burden with pride because my little girl, Emily, was the center of my world, her fragile body often failing her, but her spirit shining brighter than anyone else's. And though my husband, Daniel, and I had endured countless restless nights filled with hospital visits, medications, and therapy appointments, we clung to each other and to the little joys life still offered us. Like Emily's giggles when the wind ruffled her hair, or the way Daniel would lift her out of her wheelchair and spin her around until her laughter filled the air. Yet, even in these moments of joy, there was always a shadow over us. The Homeowners Association, led by a woman named Marjorie and her circle of petty enforcers, who seemed to take a special delight in finding new ways to torment us. Whether it was issuing notices about Emily's wheelchair ramp being an eyesore or sending warnings that the adapted van parked in front of our house was against their community aesthetic standards. And though I bit my tongue for months, Daniel's patience was thinner than mine, his protective instincts kicking in every time he saw Emily cry after overhearing neighbors whisper cruel things about her. Still, he tried to keep peace for my sake, because he knew I wanted Emily to have stability, but one could sense a storm building in his eyes, a storm Marjorie either couldn't see or foolishly believed she could control. And it wasn't long before her suspicions about Daniel began to grow, suspicions that had nothing to do with grass height or trash bins, and everything to do with the way he carried himself, that rigid posture, the subtle scars across his arms, the way his gaze lingered on every corner as though he were assessing threats. And while to me these were reminders of the man I loved and the battles he had survived long before we met, to Marjorie they became fuel for gossip, whispers that spread quickly through the neighborhood like poison, with murmurs that Daniel wasn't who he claimed to be, that maybe his past wasn't as clean as we thought. And I'll never forget the night I overheard her outside at dusk, speaking to another neighbor in that sharp, cutting tone of hers, saying, "Mark my words, there's something off about that man, and I'm going to find out what it is." Words that chilled me to the bone, because I knew that whatever secrets Daniel carried deep inside him, secrets he never fully shared, even with me, Marjorie was too nosy, too vindictive, and far too dangerous to leave them buried. And as I closed the blinds that night and pulled Emily into my arms, a knot formed in my stomach, a sense that our peaceful facade was cracking, and though I tried to brush it off, telling myself she was just another bitter neighbor with too much time on her hands, deep down I knew Marjorie wasn't just being curious, she was preparing to drag us into a nightmare, one that would cost us more than we ever imagined. It didn't take long for Marjorie's suspicions to turn into action, and soon Daniel and I found ourselves facing not just her, but the full weight of the HOA board, which seemed less like a group of concerned neighbors and more like a pack of wolves circling their prey, led by Marjorie's closest allies. Howard, a retired accountant with too much time on his hands and a permanent scowl etched into his face, and Denise, a sharp-tongued woman who lived 3 houses down and seemed to know every scrap of gossip before it even left someone's lips, and together, this trio made it their mission to harass us under the thin guise of upholding community standards, issuing us notice after notice for petty infractions like Emily's ramp not being painted the proof shade of beige or the small garden Daniel had planted for her being too close to the sidewalk. But I knew these weren't about rules, they were about power, about control, and worst of all about targeting the most vulnerable among us, because Emily, with her gentle eyes and fragile frame, became their favorite excuse, their whispered jabs that she was too noisy in her wheelchair or too disruptive with her medical equipment, poisoning the neighborhood until even people we once thought were friends began avoiding us, nodding politely but quickly crossing the street when they saw us coming. Daniel tried to shield me from it, saying over and over that as long as we kept our heads down, the storm would pass, but even I could see his jaw tightening, his fists clenching when he thought I wasn't looking, and I feared not the HOA, but what they were slowly awakening in him, because every time Marjorie stood on our porch, wagging her finger and threatening us with fines we couldn't afford, I could see something flicker in Daniel's eyes, something dark and controlled, as though he was remembering a version of himself he had long tried to bury, The whispers around the neighborhood grew more sinister too. People, muttering that Daniel had been seen late at night, walking the streets like he was on patrol, others claiming he was stashing weapons in the garage, rumors that sounded absurd, yet carried just enough bite to make them dangerous. And one night, when I thought the worst thing had already been said, Denise leaned across the HOA table during a so-called community meeting and sneered, "We all deserve to know who we're living next to. What are you hiding, Daniel?" Leaving the room in a hush as Daniel's face turned to stone, his silence more terrifying than any words he could have spoken. After that, things escalated quickly. Our mailbox was smashed, Emily's wheelchair tires mysteriously slashed, and though we reported it, the police shrugged, calling it a civil matter, which only emboldened the HOA further. And while Daniel stayed strong for Emily, whispering to her that nothing would ever harm her while he was around, I could feel the foundation of our lives shaking, every laugh. From our daughter shadowed by the thought that at any moment Marjorie and her allies would show up with another false claim, another humiliating confrontation. Then came the night I'll never forget, when I walked past the clubhouse and overheard Marjorie's voice through the open window, low and cutting, saying, "He thinks he can fool us, but I found his file, and once the neighbors see who he really is, they'll know we have to take action." And though I didn't understand what file she meant, the words froze me in place because in that moment it was clear. This wasn't just harassment anymore. This was a hunt, and Daniel was the prey, and whatever truth he had buried about his past, Marjorie was determined to dig it up and use it to destroy us, no matter the cost. The pressure mounted like a tightening vice around our family, and though Daniel tried to act as though nothing could shake him, I could see the toll it was taking. Late at night, when he thought I was asleep, he would sit in the living room with the lights off, staring out the window, his hands clasped so tightly they trembled, his lips moving silently as if repeating a mantra to himself. And in those moments, I knew he wasn't here in our home. He was somewhere else, somewhere darker, somewhere his mind refused to leave behind. Emily, innocent and tender-hearted, sensed it too, because she began asking me questions no little girl should have to ask, like, "Mommy, why do people hate us? Or did I do something wrong to make them mad?" And each time she asked, my chest burned with a fury I tried to swallow. Because how could I explain to her that grown adults had chosen to make her life harder just because she was different, just because she needed more love and care than most? Children, and while I comforted her, Daniel would pace the room like a caged animal, unable to sit still, unable to listen without his anger rising to the surface. Then came the bills, fine after fine, stacked neatly in envelopes on our kitchen counter, hundreds of dollars we didn't have, each one stamped in bold letters with words like "final warning" or "violation notice." And every time Daniel opened one, I saw the veins bulge in his temples, his control slipping, until one night he slammed the stack down on the table and hissed, "They want a war, and I won't let them win." Words that made me shiver because he wasn't just talking about fines anymore, he was talking about something bigger, something darker, and it wasn't long before rumors started spreading faster than wildfire. Neighbors whispering that Daniel had been in the military, others saying he'd worked for some secret agency, and though I dismissed them in public, behind closed doors I couldn't deny there were things I didn't fully know about him. Scars on his body he never explained, nightmares that jolted him awake in the middle of the night. The way his eyes darted to exits in every room as if he were planning escape routes, and when I pressed him gently, he would only say, "Some things are better left in the past," before changing the subject. But now that past was creeping into our present whether he liked it or not. Marjorie, relentless as ever, called an emergency HOA meeting, inviting the entire neighborhood under the pretense of ensuring safety, and I'll never forget the chill in the air that evening when Daniel and I walked Emily home from therapy and saw groups of neighbors gathering outside, whispering and pointing at our house as if we were criminals, not a family just trying to live in peace. And though Daniel tried to carry Emily inside before she noticed, she had already heard a boy shout, "Don't go near them. Her dad's dangerous." Words that made her lower her head, tears streaming down her cheeks as she begged me to make it stop, begged me to tell her she was safe, and in that moment I knew something irreversible had been set into motion. That night, as Emily slept clutching her stuffed rabbit, Daniel finally broke his silence, his voice low and heavy, telling me that he had done things in his past, things he wasn't proud of, things he had kept hidden to protect us. And though he didn't go into detail, the weight in. His eyes told me it was the kind of truth that could shatter everything, but before I could ask more, a knock rattled the door. A neighbor we barely knew, nervous and trembling, whispering urgently, "They're planning something tonight. You need to be ready," before disappearing into the dark, leaving Daniel standing there with a look I had never seen before, a look that told me he already knew this day would come, and that nothing could stop it now. The night it all came crashing down began deceptively quiet, the kind of silence that presses against your skin like a warning you can't quite name. And while Emily lay asleep in her room, clutching her stuffed rabbit, Daniel and I sat in the dim glow of the kitchen light, the air heavy with unspoken words, when suddenly the sharp crunch of footsteps echoed outside, followed by the unmistakable beam of flashlights cutting across our lawn, and Daniel's entire body stiffened as he rose from his chair, motioning for me to stay back as he peered through the blinds, his jaw tightening when he saw not just Marjorie, but Howard, Denise, and nearly a dozen others standing in a cluster at the edge of our yard, their faces twisted with the kind of righteous fury that made my stomach drop. I whispered for him to ignore them, to let it go. But Daniel shook his head slowly, whispering back, "They're not here to talk. They're here to end this." And before I could argue, Marjorie's shrill voice pierced the night, carrying across the street as she shouted, "We will not tolerate dangerous men hiding in our community. Come out and face us." And though her words were aimed at Daniel, I felt every neighbor's eyes on our home, every whispered accusation turned into fuel for the mob that had gathered. Daniel stepped onto the porch, his tall frame silhouetted against the kitchen light, and though his voice was calm, I could hear the steel in it as he said, "Go home, Marjorie, you don't know what you're doing." But she only smirked, raising a folder in her hand and shaking it triumphantly, declaring, "I know exactly what I'm doing. This community deserves to know who you really are." And as the crowd murmured, Daniel's knuckles turned white around the railing, his chest rising and falling with controlled fury. But he didn't move, didn't speak until Howard stepped forward and spat, "We don't want killers living among us." And though I wanted to scream that it wasn't true, that they didn't know him, my voice caught in my throat when Daniel's expression shifted just slightly to something between pain and resignation, and he whispered to me without turning his head, "Take Emily and stay inside, no matter what happens." Words that made my knees buckle, because they carried the weight of finality, as though he already knew it was coming. Suddenly, Denise pulled out her phone and barked into it, "Yes, officers, we have him surrounded. Come now, before he hurts someone." And in that instant, I realized they weren't just threatening, they were orchestrating, manipulating, turning the system against us, and panic flooded me as Emily, awakened by the shouting, wheeled herself into the living room, her eyes wide with terror as she cried, "Daddy, don't let them take you." And Daniel's face softened only for her, crouching to meet her eyes and whisper, "No one will ever take me from you, sweetheart." Before standing again, his shoulders squared, his presence suddenly commanding like a soldier stepping back into a battlefield he thought he'd left behind. The shouting grew louder, the mob pressing closer to our porch, flashlights blinding us, voices blending into a roar of accusation, until the first stone hit our mailbox and shattered the night with a metallic clang, sending Emily into sobs as I pulled her into my arms. And then everything happened at once. Daniel moved to block the door, Marjorie screamed that he was reaching for a weapon, neighbors surged forward, and amidst the chaos, a single deafening crack split the air, the unmistakable sound of a gunshot tearing through the night, followed by a collective gasp as Daniel staggered back, his hand clutching his chest, his eyes locking on mine with a look of shock and sorrow. And though time seemed to freeze, the last thing I remember before the world collapsed into screams was the sound of Emily's voice, shrill and broken, crying out, "Daddy," as Daniel crumpled to the porch, his blood spreading fast beneath him while the HOA stood frozen, their flashlights illuminating the horror they had unleashed. The moment the gunshot echoed through the neighborhood, everything dissolved into chaos. Yet for me, it all moved in a kind of slow-motion horror, because as Daniel collapsed onto the porch, his hand pressed desperately against the crimson stain spreading across his shirt, I screamed his name so loudly that my own throat tore, while Emily tried to wheel herself forward toward him, her cries breaking like glass against the night, and I clutched her back against me because I couldn't let her see. What I was seeing, the life draining out of the only man who had ever fought so fiercely to protect us. Marjorie, for once, looked shaken, her hand trembling as she clutched that ridiculous folder to her chest like a shield. But Denise was quick to step forward, her voice cutting through the crowd as she shouted, "He lunged at us, we had no choice, it was self-defense." And I wanted to leap at her, to tear the lie from her throat, because Daniel had done nothing but stand tall and try to shield us, yet the neighbors were already murmuring, their fear twisting into belief as Howard chimed in. I saw it, he was reaching for something, and in that moment the script was already being written, one where Daniel was the aggressor, the dangerous man who finally snapped, and we were the unlucky victims of his wrath, even though I knew the truth was the complete opposite. The wail of sirens filled the air soon after, the flashing red and blue lights painting our house in a surreal glow. As officers swarmed the scene, their voices barking orders, their guns drawn as they forced Daniel's limp body onto the ground and shouted at me to back away, and I screamed at them to help him, begged them not to waste another second, but my words fell into the void as they focused instead on Marjorie and her allies, who rushed to spin their version of events, sobbing and pointing fingers at my husband, crying about how terrified they had been, how he was a threat to the community, and as I held Emily in my arms, her tiny body shaking uncontrollably, I realized with a sickening dread that the truth didn't matter here. Numbers did, voices did, and the HOA had them in abundance. Daniel, somehow still breathing, was lifted onto a stretcher, his eyes fluttering as he searched for mine, and in that brief, heart-shattering instant, I saw him try to form words, his lips moving silently, and I knew he was trying to tell me to stay strong, to protect Emily, but before I could respond, he was wheeled away into the ambulance, the doors slamming shut like a final blow. I thought the nightmare couldn't get worse. But then an officer, a broad-shouldered man with a weary face, pulled me aside, lowering his voice so the others wouldn't hear, and said words that froze my blood. "Ma'am, I know who your husband really is, and if I were you, I'd keep that little girl of yours close, because this is far from over." And though I wanted to demand answers, to scream at him for speaking in riddles when my husband's life was slipping away, he only gave me a look filled with something between pity and fear before turning back to the crowd, leaving me with nothing but questions swirling in my head and Emily's sobs soaking into my shoulder. Meanwhile, Marjorie, emboldened now that she had painted herself as a victim, was already giving statements to the police, her voice shaking with practiced tears as she declared, "We warned the board for months. We told them he was dangerous. We had to protect our neighborhood," and Denise stood at her side, nodding furiously, feeding the lie like kindling to a fire, while I, the only person who knew the truth, stood powerless, my words drowned out by their performance. And as the flashing lights faded into the distance and Daniel disappeared into the night, I made a silent vow. Whatever his past was, whatever secrets he had hidden from me, I would uncover them, and I would use them. Because if Marjorie thought she had won tonight, she had no idea who she had just awakened. The hours after Daniel was taken to the hospital stretched like an eternity, each tick of the clock pounding in my chest as I sat in that sterile waiting room with Emily curled in my lap, her tears finally giving way to quiet hiccups as exhaustion dragged her into an uneasy sleep, and all the while my mind spiraled, replaying the officer's cryptic words over and over. "I know who your husband really is," until the phrase itself felt like a blade carving deeper into my heart, because for years I had accepted the pieces of Daniel he allowed me to see, the scars he never explained, the nights when he bolted awake drenched in sweat, the way he always positioned himself with his back to a wall in restaurants, scanning every exit like his life depended on it. But now, with his blood still staining my hands, I could no longer pretend those were just quirks of a haunted man. I needed answers, and I needed them now, and fate, cruel as it was, delivered them not from Daniel himself, but from the very folder Marjorie had waved triumphantly on my porch, because when the police finally left our house that morning after combing through every corner for evidence that wasn't there, they left behind a copy of the HOA's evidence packet, a thick manila file that I tore open with shaking hands while Emily slept on the couch, and what I found inside made the world tilt on its axis. Military documents, discharge papers, photographs of Daniel in uniform standing among men whose eyes looked every bit as hardened as his commendations for bravery, but Also, classified memos stamped with bold black ink that screamed restricted, and tucked among them a newspaper clipping, yellowed and folded, detailing a covert operation overseas where an entire enemy cell had been dismantled by a special unit whose names were never released, but the photo accompanying it might as well have been a knife to my chest because there, blurred in the background, was Daniel, younger but unmistakable, his jaw set. In that same unyielding way I had seen 1,000 times, my hands trembled as I pieced it together. My husband hadn't just been a soldier, he had been something more, something hidden, someone trained to fight wars in the shadows and then vanish, and suddenly every quiet glance over his shoulder, every moment of silence when I asked about his past, made sense. But what gutted me most was realizing that Marjorie had weaponized it, that she had dug until she unearthed fragments she couldn't possibly understand and twisted them into proof that he was dangerous, when in reality the only thing dangerous was her obsession with control. Still, the more I read, the more a chilling clarity settled over me, because buried within those documents was also a warning, a note written in a hand I didn't recognize but addressed to Daniel by name, stating plainly, "They'll never stop looking for you, you know too much. Protect your family at all costs." My breath caught as I stared at the words, the final puzzle piece snapping into place, and I understood now why he had always lived like a man waiting for the other shoe to drop, why he had insisted on moving us into a quiet suburb far from the city, why he bristled whenever unknown cars drove slowly down our street. He had been trying to shield us not from Marjorie or her petty HOA, but from ghosts that stretched far beyond our neighborhood, ghosts that had followed him even here, and though Marjorie couldn't possibly have grasped the danger, her meddling had lit a fuse that threatened to burn us all. When I finally saw Daniel again, hours later in his hospital room, pale and weak, but alive, his hand gripping mine with surprising strength, he whispered, "I want to keep it from you, to keep you safe, but they forced my hand," and though his voice cracked, his eyes burned with the same fire I had seen on the battlefield of our porch, and he told me enough for me to understand that he had walked away from a life of violence, of secrets, of blood spilled in silence, because he wanted nothing more than to be a husband and a father. But men like him weren't allowed to walk away without consequences, and now those consequences were knocking on our door, dressed as friendly neighbors with clipboards and bylaws, but behind them lurked something darker, something even Daniel feared. I squeezed his hand and promised him that no matter what truth lay ahead, no matter what he had done or who he had been, Emily and I were his family, and we would not let them rewrite his story into something monstrous. But as I kissed his forehead and felt the weight of his words pressing against me, I also knew something else. I wasn't just a mother or a wife anymore. I was a woman with a mission, because if Marjorie and her HOA thought exposing Daniel's past gave them power, they had no idea what kind of power I carried in mine, and soon, very soon, they were going to find out. For days after the shooting, our home became both a crime scene and a stage where Marjorie paraded her lies, giving interviews to local reporters, painting herself as the savior who had protected the neighborhood from a dangerous man. And though her words cut deeper than the bullet that tore through Daniel, I held my silence, not because I was weak, but because silence was a weapon when used correctly, and while the HOA basked in their false victory, I worked quietly in the shadows, gathering every shred of evidence they had so carelessly left behind, every threatening note, every violation slip, every false police report, weaving them together into a net they wouldn't be able to escape. And while I did this, Emily, braver than anyone gave her credit for, clung to her father's bedside, whispering to him about the garden he promised to rebuild, the walks he promised to take her on once he healed, her innocent faith fueling my resolve. But what Marjorie never understood, what she couldn't have possibly predicted, was that I wasn't just a grieving wife or a desperate mother. I was something far more dangerous to her empire of petty power, because before I was Mrs. Daniels, before I gave up my maiden name and buried it beneath suburban normalcy, I had been Veronica Hale, a federal investigator who once specialized in dismantling corrupt organizations from the inside out, and though I had walked away from that life to build one filled with love and family, the skills, the connections, the instincts, they had never left me, and now, Forced into the open by their arrogance, I was ready to use every single one of them. My first move was subtle. I reached out to old contacts, men and women who owed me favors, and within days, documents that Marjorie thought were hidden in HOA filing cabinets found their way into my hands, exposing a trail of embezzlement, fraudulent fines, and misuse of community funds so staggering it could send half the board to prison. But I didn't stop there, because while corruption was one thing, attempted murder was another, and I tracked down neighbors who had seen what really happened that night, those too frightened to speak up when Marjorie and Denise silenced the crowd with their rehearsed lies. And I sat with them at kitchen tables, looked them in the eyes, and told them the truth. That Daniel wasn't a monster, that the HOA had orchestrated the attack, and slowly, like cracks in glass, their silence began to shatter. Meanwhile, I dug into Marjorie herself, peeling back layers of her pristine facade until I uncovered the rot beneath. Bankruptcies she had hidden, lawsuits she had settled quietly, even a brother serving time for fraud, and when I finally assembled it all into one damning dossier, I felt the old fire ignite in me again. The same fire that once brought down men who thought themselves untouchable, and I knew it was time to strike. The climax came at the next HOA meeting, held arrogantly in the clubhouse where they had plotted against my husband, and I walked in not as a victim, but as Veronica Hale, armed with files, witnesses, and a voice that could no longer be silenced, my every step echoing against the floor as the room fell quiet, neighbors turning in their chairs, whispers rippling as they saw the look on my face. Marjorie, ever the actress, tried to regain control, sneering, "You don't belong here." But I cut her off with a voice so steady it startled even me, saying, "I belong here more than you ever did. Because while you played queen of this neighborhood, I've been uncovering the crimes you thought you buried." And then I laid it all out, the fraudulent fines, the stolen money, the lies told to the police, the witnesses who had finally broken their silence. And as gasps filled the room, as the weight of truth bore down on every smug face around that table, Marjorie's mask cracked for the first time, her hands trembling as she sputtered excuses. But it was too late, because the officers I had called were already waiting outside, armed with warrants, ready to drag her empire of cruelty into the light. The chaos that followed was almost poetic, Denise shrieking as she was handcuffed, Howard going pale as documents were seized, neighbors turning their backs on the very people they had once obeyed, and through it all I stood, unshaken, Emily's hand gripping mine, her wide eyes watching as justice, real justice, finally began to take root. When Marjorie was led past me, her once perfect hair disheveled, her face twisted with rage, she hissed, "You'll regret this." And I leaned in close enough for only her to hear, whispering, "No, Marjorie, you will," before turning away, feeling a weight lift from my chest for the first time in months. In weeks that followed, as Daniel slowly healed and the neighborhood slowly mended, whispers turned into apologies, and people who once crossed the street to avoid us now knocked on our door to offer support, but I didn't care about their guilt, only about the man I loved and the daughter we protected. And one quiet evening, as Emily sat between us in the garden Daniel had finally replanted, she looked up at me with a smile and said, "Mommy, you saved Daddy." And though I squeezed her hand and nodded, I knew the truth ran deeper. When the HOA pulled the trigger on my little girl's dad, they didn't just shatter our family, they awakened a part of me that I thought I had buried forever. And that mistake, that single miscalculation, had changed everything, because I was no longer just their neighbor, I was the storm they never saw coming.